Hi, and welcome back to the henabled podcast. This is the show all about sharing our experiences of disability, neurodivergence, and long-term health conditions in the UK higher education system. I'm Kath, and this week I am joined by Nicola. She is a PhD researcher at the University of Stirling, looking at social media's impact on literary production. Nicola also does loads of work for disability advocacy, including as the newly assigned, blog representative for the Disabled Leaders Network. It's a pleasure to have Nicola on today. So let's get to it. Hi, Nicola. Welcome to the show.
Hi there. Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
Pleasure to have you. Please, could you just introduce yourself and share a little about your background in higher education?
Yeah, cool. So I'm Nicola, and my background in higher education began really with studying English literature at the University of St Andrews. And in Scotland, undergrad degrees are typically 4 years rather than 3, which is actually one of the reasons why I applied mainly to Scottish unis. I really like that flexibility. So yeah, after those 4 years, I went on to do a postgrad degree in publishing studies at the University of Stirling. I then spent several years working full-time in the publishing industry before returning to higher education in 2021, I believe. At that point, I was fortunate to receive a doctoral training partnership scholarship from this is such a long name, but the Scottish Graduate School for Arts and Humanities, which is often shortened to SAGSA. So this funded my PhD for 3.5 years, and I'm currently in the final year of that programme at the University of Stirling. And my research sits between publishing studies and communications, media and culture, and focuses on the impact of social media on contemporary literary production. And yeah, as you pointed out, alongside my academic work, I'm also very involved in advocacy within higher education, very much informed by my lived experience of having an invisible chronic illness. So I sit on Advanced HE's Disabled Student Commitment Advisory Group. I'm EDI rep for SAGSA's Doctoral Researcher Committee and work as a student assessor for the Mental Health Charter Award, which is run by Student Minds. So yeah, so I'm really passionate about improving the kind of culture and structures within higher education so that they're more inclusive and supportive for future students, really.
I mean, to be honest, I was going through what you do and I was like, there's no way I can fit these all into the questions that I'm going to ask. Like, you actually do so much. It's incredible. But I also didn't know about Scotland's 4-year degrees.
Yeah, they're really great.
It's not like America, I take it, where you have like the major minor system and you kind of go in blind. Like, I guess you apply for a subject, but...
Yeah, so you apply for a subject. So in my case, I applied for English Lit. And the way it works is that for your sub-honour years, so for your first year and your second year, you have quite a lot of flexibility. You do your main subject. So for me, that was English. And then you can do up to 2 other subjects. So in first year, I did English, history, and film studies. And then I also did in second year English, film studies and linguistics. But then your honours years, so third and fourth year, you kind of pick what your final degree will be in. And it can, even if so for example, I went in as English Lit, I could have ended up with a degree in English Lit and history if I wanted to. It's really flexible. It is kind of a little bit like the American system in that you have that breadth. But yeah, it's something I really enjoyed about the Scottish degree structure.
No, I did a dual honours bachelor's, but I had to say I was doing dual honours from the start kind of thing. So I did English literature and linguistics at York,
cool.
but the department's English and related literature. So it also included like film studies. I did film modules because it was related. It was great. I actually like that kind of stuff's really good. And I've met some people from St Andrews before and it just sounded like it was a great time. And then you went to industry, came back. I guess you kind of been building on your experience the whole time though. Like, how was it going from working in publishing to doing a master's in it? Oh no, that was after.
Yeah, so I did my master's, then I worked in publishing, and now I'm back from like a research perspective. And I did like a few internships as well in publishing during my master's, which really helped that kind of transition into industry.
Next question. So if you're comfortable saying, how does your disabilities impact your experience of higher education?
Yeah, so my main form of disability is cystic fibrosis, which is a genetic condition. So I've had it all my life, and I was diagnosed with it at birth. And CF is a systemic illness, but it is largely thought of as a lung condition, as it does mostly affect the lungs. So yeah, if you hear me coughing a little bit throughout, that'll be why. And it's caused by a genetic mutation that means that cells in the body are unable to move salt and water around effectively. So people with CF, as a result, experience a buildup of thick, sticky mucus in the lungs and digestive system and kind of other organs, which causes kind of a wide range of symptoms, really. I don't know how accurate this is, but they say that if you breathe through a straw and pinch your nose, that's kind of what it feels like to breathe when you have CF. So you'll have to try it and let me know. But it comes with a whole load of comorbidities, but the ones I kind of specifically struggle with are digestion issues. So I have to take tablets every single time I eat something, fatigue and CF related arthritis, which I was diagnosed with just as I went to university, which was really helpful. And yeah, so I think firstly, my disability has fundamentally shaped my experience of higher education in the sense that it very much dictated what I chose to study in the first place. CF is a progressive condition that until relatively recently came with a significantly reduced life expectancy. So growing up with that prognosis and with the sense that you probably aren't going to live into your 30s kind of really altered how I thought about the future, including kind of whether university is something I could even plan for. But for me, I always knew that I wanted to go to university. I went to a grammar school growing up where there was a very strong university focus culture, and it was very much seen as the expected next step. But I think when I was choosing my degree, I wasn't thinking, I guess, strategically in the way that we often encourage young people to. So I wasn't thinking about, career pathways or employability or long-term progression, because in my mind, I didn't really need to, because I kind of didn't really expect to be here for those things to come into play, if that makes sense. Yeah. So instead, I kind of chose purely based on what I enjoyed studying at the time. And that's kind of how I ended up with English Lit. And yeah, so in many ways, that decision was shaped by my health and my understanding of kind of my own future at that point, and really laid the foundation for everything that came afterwards within my higher education journey. It's also worth pointing out that the picture has become a little bit more complicated in many ways, but a lot more hopeful as well over the last kind of 5 to 10 years with my disability, since the introduction of modulator therapies, which have completely transformed outcomes for many people with cystic fibrosis. But those kind of early attitudes around life expectancy had a lasting impact on how I approached higher education for my undergrad specifically. But in terms of how my condition affects my experience of higher education, I deal with kind of regular hospital appointments and treatments and significant periods of illness, all of which can impact attendance and energy levels. So on a day-to-day basis, it requires a lot of planning and careful management of time and energy. So, for example, my treatment plan is quite intensive. So I take around 30 to 40 tablets a day. I do 3 to 4 nebulizers a day. I have 2 kind of physiotherapy sessions a day, and then need to kind of clean all my equipment and get everything sorted for the next day. So managing all that alongside lectures and reading and research can be quite challenging. I'm also very prone to chest infections, which over time kind of significantly scar and damage your lungs. So that often requires significant IV antibiotic treatment in hospital. Thankfully, I have been able to self-administer these at home since I was about 16, which really helps. But I typically need IV treatment about 3 to 4 times a year. Unfortunately, that has kind of increased a little bit over the last year, but that can kind of really disrupt my attendance. And in undergrad, when attendance was closely monitored, that was particularly difficult. But now as a PhD student, the flexibility of kind of being in charge of my own schedule really helps. But I think I still feel an impact in terms of, I guess, momentum, kind of feeling like I can't get everything done. It also sort of becomes like a vicious cycle, in that because when I'm stressed, all my symptoms tend to get worse. So it does kind of feel a bit like a vicious cycle sometimes. But related to that, and I'm sure you can agree with this, but managing managing a disability can very much feel like a part-time job in itself, which kind of leaves, limited time and energy for other expectations within a PhD. So attending conferences and teaching and submitting articles, etc. So often just getting the bare minimum done is a challenge for me. Higher education, especially at the postgraduate research level, and especially in the current climate, can sometimes feel like it kind of feels like it runs on sort of overwork, but that's disguised as passion. And when you're kind of not able to operate at the same pace as your peers, it can really be quite demoralizing, and it's easy to feel like, you're not good enough or that you don't belong, and all those types of feelings. I think as well, cystic fibrosis also comes with kind of fatigue and brain fog. So even on good days, it can kind of take me longer to read and write and focus compared to other students. On particularly bad days, I rely a lot on sort of audiobooks or other assistive tech to kind of help me get through the work I need to get done. I also need to eat more than the typical person to maintain my weight because of how much extra effort it is to breathe. So I need around 4,000 calories a day, which means I have to just be a little bit more intentional about fitting in extra time for eating throughout my day, which sounds great, to be fair. And as a foodie, I'm not complaining. But it can be. I love food. But it can be challenging on busy days where it's kind of, full of meetings and the general demands of higher education. Arthritis wasn't much of a huge issue during undergrad, but it really peaked during my postgrad studies. So I live with daily pain, but there are flare-ups that are particularly severe, and that often coincides with chest exacerbations as well. So like I said, it does kind of feel like a vicious cycle sometimes. And during postgrad, there were times where I were effectively sort of bedbound for days, which, especially when I was living alone in student halls, probably wasn't the most ideal or particularly safe. One treatment I take to sort of manage my arthritis is a very low dose of a drug that was kind of originally developed as chemotherapy. And that has helped immensely with kind of my pain and my arthritis flare-ups, but it also suppresses my immune system, so it makes me more susceptible to illness. So I have to be particularly careful around sort of cold and flu season, and obviously freshers flu at uni was never fun. So I just have to be super careful not to be around people that are sick, because even sort of catching the common cold can escalate into me being in hospital for a few weeks. So overall, I think living with all those things has really taught me to kind of navigate unpredictability and sort of balance workload with my health, and constantly sort of advocate for adjustments when needed.
We'll get into this more later as well, but that's a very, I think, concise summary of something I didn't previously really know much about, I guess. Yeah, you don't really think much about conditions like cystic fibrosis unless you're necessarily living them. But that must take a lot of effort. And also when you were touching on traveling to conferences, that must be really frustrating because a lot of conferences are overseas. You can't necessarily get hundreds of tablets abroad.
Yeah, there's just a lot more to think about, a lot more to sort of budget for. It's been really great. Obviously, I started the PhD in 2021, so we were very much into the pandemic at that point, and a lot of things were online, which were absolutely amazing from an accessibility standpoint. It's been a little bit frustrating in recent years, kind of seeing a return back to only in-person conferences and events, but for the most part, that sort of hybrid way of working has been tremendous.
That's so good. We'll talk a little bit now. I appreciate that your access to higher education might have been interesting from a personal perspective, because obviously you weren't sure if you were going to make it that long, which is quite a heavy thing if you think about it. But just be like, I do what I enjoy, and I mean that's good. But answer this, it can be about your undergrad, it can be about your postgrad, but what was your experience accessing higher education from a disability standpoint?
Yeah, so when I was first applying to university, I wasn't really approaching it from a disability access perspective in the way that I would now. My priorities were much more focused on the course itself and the reputation of the institution. I think if I were applying today, disability support would probably be one of the first things I looked at. But back then, it just wasn't really on my radar in the same way. But once I'd kind of firmed my university choice, I had a disabled students allowance needs assessment over the summer, which was then sent to the university so that everything could, in theory, be in place for the start of the semester. And that process was actually very positive. I sat down with someone and just talked through how my condition affects my studies and what adjustments might help. I had a support plan from my secondary school, which very much kind of guided that discussion and the access needs that I requested. And for the most part, what was recommended was implemented really smoothly and worked really well in practice. I think some of the issues came more from that sort of internalized guilt or fear for asking for accommodations, particularly as someone with an invisible illness. You know, most of the time I can look absolutely fine on the outside, but actually inside my lungs are working at half their capacity and I'm really struggling to breathe. As well, I think there's also the part of me that's, you know, my condition is progressive and there's kind of a very real need to sort of constantly check in with myself and have quite realistic evaluations on whether my needs are changing or if a new symptom means something isn't quite working in the right way. And that was quite tough to do alongside everything else that you're adjusting to when you're just starting at university. I know disability disclosure is also a very real barrier for many, but for me, I've always been very vocal and very open about my disability because I think that visibility is so crucial to the wider kind of public awareness and understanding. So thankfully, that was never really an issue for me, which I'm very thankful for. But yeah, so through that process, some of the accommodations I received were a fridge in my uni halls to store medications, which slightly hilariously also made me quite popular during Freshers Week because I had extra fridge space to store everyone's alcohol in, which was great, not the intended purpose, but, you know.
Useful.
I was sort of offered accommodation right next to the English department as well, which made getting to classes much easier. I had extended library loans and printing credit, assistive tech like speech-to-text software. I had a printer in my room so I didn't have to constantly travel across campus. I had extra time in exams with the option to type as well rather than handwrite, which was particularly helpful for my arthritis. I was also offered a note taker as well, although I didn't end up needing one in the end. Yeah, so from that initial point of access, those accommodations were relatively easy to use day to day and were in place as soon as I arrived, which made a huge difference in sort of easing that transition into university. Where things became slightly more complicated before arriving at university was during my postgrad studies, actually. When applying for postgrad accommodation, I had outlined my access needs in that application and had requested to live on campus and as close as possible to where my teaching would be for those sort of same logistical reasons. But over the summer, I received my accommodation allocation and had been placed in a hall not on campus, and actually the furthest away you could pretty much get.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. So after a lot of back and forth with the accommodation office, it emerged that my accessibility requirements had been completely missed when they were assigning accommodation. And by that point, because this was kind of June, July, I think, at this point, and the semester was starting in September, by that point, all the suitable accessible rooms had been allocated. So for about 2 weeks, I genuinely thought that I might not be able to attend the course at all because that commute would have just been completely inaccessible to me. But thankfully, an adapted studio flat on campus became available right at the last minute. So it all worked out, but it very easily could not have. And that was quite frustrating. But yeah, overall, I think while I was able to access that support, that sort of accommodation process really highlighted to me how easily, you know, one missed seemingly insignificant detail to someone can have quite a disproportionate impact on whether higher education is genuinely accessible.
And it's that thing, right, where it's never malice, but it's always just the little things that go missing. So this is all just fantastic for like me to learn about this. Doesn't sound very fantastic to go through in terms of losing your adjustments. We never particularly like that, but again, like this is a world I'm unfamiliar with. I don't really know much about it, but you don't think, I guess, because so much co-occurs with what many people think of as a lung condition. There's so many more accommodations I just had no idea about, and it sounds like for the most part they were quite good other than that, just both unis in general, which is very encouraging and very good to see. But small mistakes can really, like, they can mean so much to people.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, to be fair though, it's a good transition to the next question. Did you encounter any obstacles during your experience of higher education? Did you overcome them? And if so, how?
Yeah, I think, I describe my experience as a bit of a mixture. I think the formal accommodations I had were genuinely like really helpful and necessary, but many of the structural realities of higher education, in my opinion, just simply aren't designed with chronic illness in mind, and that has created a lot of obstacles. One of the biggest issues I had during my undergrad was attendance. So, when I'm in hospital with a chest infection, I obviously physically can't attend a seminar. And this was pre-COVID, so lectures weren't recorded. Hybrid learning wasn't really an option. And there was at least one module where missing a certain number of seminars meant you'd automatically fail that module. And I vividly remember being in hospital in Manchester, worrying about how I was going to get back to Scotland for a 10 a.m. seminar, because that was just the reality of the situation. So there was very little flexibility or willingness to engage with alternative arrangements. Exams were also another major challenge. Every exam period seemed to coincide with me being at my most unwell. It's winter in Scotland, my joints are flaring. I'd often have repeated chest infections. I was exhausted after a 12-week term. And at my undergrad university, exams took place before Christmas, and also always used to fall on my birthday, which was really annoying. But yeah, so fundamentally, those conditions obviously just weren't ones in which I could perform at my best. I always got through them and I always got, good grades, but at a real detriment to myself and my health and well-being. And I think what's frustrating in that aspect is knowing that universities often do have the capacity to be flexible. I mean, we saw that in the pandemic. They're not beholden to exam boards in the same way schools are, but that flexibility just wasn't extended to me back then. And things improved significantly when I moved into postgrad study. My postgrad institution felt kind of like a breath of fresh air. There was much more flexibility. Coursework arrangements could be shifted when needed, and the overall culture felt a lot more inclusive, and that made a real difference. In terms of advocacy, I did have a disability advisor during my undergrad. I can't say it was always the most helpful experience. And I think that just comes down to they're clearly working within a system that's just not designed for chronically ill students. And a lot of the time I felt like I was still advocating for myself with just kind of them copied into the email. Obviously, my PhD experience has been different again. On the one hand, it's far more flexible and I have a lot more control over my time. On the other hand, the stop-start nature of my health means I often feel like I'm constantly on the back foot. It's a lot more complex administratively as well because I'm funded. So there are requirements from both the university standpoint, but also my funding body. But my funding body have actually been excellent. They offer sick leave, have been very supportive during periods where I've had to pause my research. Internally, though, it was quite hard to get that communication together between the two of them. So, for example, there wasn't an existing administrative process designed for someone in my situation. So they essentially had to create one, which was quite surprising to me and really highlighted how little the system is geared towards chronically ill PhD students. I've also found that a large part of navigating higher education as a disabled student depends on having someone in your corner who understands your needs and is willing to advocate for you. However, like I said, even the most supportive staff can only do so much because they're very much operating within a system that is not designed for inclusivity. From a PhD perspective as well, that support is even more crucial. A large part of success and well-being comes from your supervisory team, and I cannot overstate how wonderful mine have been. My two supervisors are genuinely so kind and supportive, and they've gone out of their way to ensure that I can engage fully with my research while managing my health, and their guidance and understanding have really made a huge difference, both academically and personally. And I honestly can say that I wouldn't be in the final year of my PhD without their support. I And yeah, I think just to finish, I think what all that points to really is a bigger issue within higher education is that it is just not fundamentally designed with chronic fluctuating conditions in mind. I think during my undergrad in particular, I was repeatedly told, well, if you're unwell, just take a leave of absence, come back and you'll be fine. But that doesn't really work when you're always unwell. And that system is built around, acute illness and not ongoing disability that's not going to go away after a few weeks off.
So the next question I have for you, I don't have many questions because you covered that all so well. The next question that I have for you is one that I normally ask. Kind of a lot of my guests are neurodivergent, but I always ask this question to all of my guests, and I get actually very interesting responses from people with especially invisible physical disabilities. Answer however you please. Have you experienced any instances of your disability proving helpful in a higher education setting?
Yeah, so I'm always a little bit cautious about the idea of disability being framed as sort of, as a superpower, but because I think that can kind of really trivialize very real struggles and barriers that disabled people face. But that said, I also don't think I'd be the person I am today without my disability and the skills and experience that have come from living with it. From an academic perspective, it's made me a strong PhD researcher, for example, in terms of self-directed study and self-motivation. I've effectively been developing those skills since school. So in my final year of A-levels, I had around 40% attendance and had to teach myself a significant portion of my A-level courses. I've sat exams from hospital rooms, I've written coursework while on IV antibiotics, and I've learned quite early on how to keep going in sort of less than ideal circumstances. And that's given me a lot of, I guess, tenacity or determination that's really needed when you have when you're doing PhD study. Living with cystic fibrosis has also forced me to be quite adaptable and resilient. I think my health can change very quickly. So I've learned to be flexible and to adjust plans and to work in ways that suit my body and kind of manage how I'm feeling at any given time. On top of that, CF care really involves sort of constant communication with a multidisciplinary medical team, which has made me a really confident communicator and advocate for myself. And I think those skills really directly translate into higher education, whether that's, navigating support systems or working with academics or articulating my access needs. At the same time, with all that being said, I'm very aware of the ableism and the accessibility issues that do exist within academia. Higher education often rewards overwork and constant availability and a very narrow idea of productivity, which can be very exclusionary for chronically ill and disabled researchers. But I think having lived with chronic illness all my life, I have a really strong sense of my own worth and clarity about what is and isn't worth sacrificing my health for, if that makes sense. So I think that perspective has really helped me navigate higher education more intentionally. And it's also why I care so much about kind of challenging the structures and the cultures within academia that continue to disadvantage disabled students and researchers.
It's also really interesting that you mention the kind of ideal productivity in academia, because I think I've had this conversation on the show before, but it's very much a situation where, in my opinion, with a lot of my other guests and friends' opinion, academia is disproportionately neurodivergent. That's just how that seems to work, because people find their special interests and they study it forever, which is fair enough. But it also means that some of those ideals of productivity can fall into productivity for neurodivergent hyperfocus, which even if you're neurodivergent can be hard to do. And that it's not even just a normal productivity standard, it's one that's an idealized neurodivergent hyperfocus standard, which isn't healthy if you're trying to force it and shouldn't be really imposed upon the many.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think there's also that sort of internalized fear, at least for me, of not wanting to appear sort of lazy in comparison to everyone else when I'm working the hardest that I can, and my body just physically won't let me do anything more. But it's that kind of, I don't want to ever seem like I'm not giving it my all, if that makes sense.
And when the standards are impossible, what do you do?
Yeah, exactly. It's a lose-lose situation.
But it sounds like you've come through and found a decent balance to that. And I guess it's just holding yourself to your own standards, because perfectionism isn't going to help anyone, especially in chronic health situations where you can't hold yourself to that standard. No one should hold themselves to a crazy high standard, because it can just ruin your mental health. But especially where there's physical barriers involved, it can be not just bad for your mental health, it can mess up so much more than that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree.
I want to move on to something a little more cheery. So as we touched on at the start of the show, I have an English degree. When you came to me asking to come on and I asked you about what you did, I thought it was incredible. So I want you to chat about your research for a second. So I was just wondering a little bit more maybe as to what your research is about. That would be helpful. Maybe just to me, I'm nerding out. And also, have you found any cool or interesting links to disability while researching it?
Yeah, so my research looks at the emergent trends in the publishing ecosystem that have developed as a result of social media, in particular the migration of creative activity from social media platforms into book publishing. So I focus mainly on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok, and explore how these platforms have reshaped literary production. So I'm really interested in how different platforms have generated distinct kinds of literature and publishing phenomena over time. So, for example, the YouTuber book boom around 2014, if you remember that, the rise of Insta poetry on Instagram, the more recent influence of BookTok. And, each of these spaces have produced its own aesthetics and communities and expectations around authorship. And my research really examines how those differences translate into a publishing context. In terms of disability, my research feels quite separate from that, unfortunately. It's only since starting the PhD that I've become more interested in exploring where those overlaps might exist. I'd love in future work to look more closely at disabled creators working within these digital spaces, or even how books by disabled authors are produced and marketed and received within the publishing industry. I'm also really interested in co-production as a research approach, particularly how co-production strategies might shape the development of children's fiction, for example. That's something I'd be really keen to explore after the PhD, especially in relation to, inclusion and representation and who gets to participate in that sort of creative process. So it's on my list of things to do, just not yet. I need to get the PhD finished first, unfortunately.
Oh, thank you for that. That was deeply, deeply interesting. I hope write-up goes well.
Thank you. Yes, it is a slow process at the moment, but we're getting there. We're getting there.
Good. Do you find that with the write-up, do you find it less stressful because it's a little more at your own pace, that you can work when you want?
I do, but I also think that, when I'm having to take 2 to 4 weeks off every few months, it can be quite disorientating. And when I'm unwell, I really try not to do any work. So that constant stop-start nature means that it always feels a bit slower to reorientate myself with the writing process. When I come back to it, I really have to spend a bit of time getting to grips of where I left off and what I still need to do. And it can be quite challenging from that perspective, I've found.
I guess if I was playing extreme devil's advocate, you get some fresh eyes on your work. But when you're trying to do something so continuous, that might not necessarily be, a helpful trade-off.
Yeah, no, it definitely, sometimes that distance away, it does come really helpful. But I think for the most part, it is just more frustrating more than anything else.
Yeah, I can absolutely see how that would be the case. Sometimes you're just trying to look for the silver linings. Like, actually, sometimes this just sucks a bit. Like, it's disabling.
Yeah, and I feel like I just kind of accepted it as well at this point. I think at the start of the PhD, it was really frustrating, but I think over the last year as well, I've been facing quite a lot of health issues, and it's just got to a point where I just kind of have to accept that this is the way it is, and work with it the best that I can.
And in a way, that means you've also done a lot of advocacy work. I guess that's come with a lot of self-acceptance as well, because you meet similar people. And that's what I actually wanted to ask you about now. So you do loads of advocacy work. I was blown away. You do the Disabled Leaders Network. You do the Scottish Graduate School for the Arts and Humanities. Student Minds you've worked with as well, which is all just awesome. You recently became the blog representative for the Disabled Leaders Network. Congratulations.
Thank you.
What I just want to ask, because you do so much, what motivates you to apply for these kind of advocacy roles?
I think my main motivator is just from seeing the gaps in how higher education supports disabled students across the full, I guess, academic journey. There's a lot of focus on getting undergrad students through the door, which of course matters, but there's far less attention paid to what happens once they're there. For example, disabled students are almost twice as likely to have considered dropping out. And there's even less attention paid to, what happens after graduation. And I think it's something like 53% of disabled graduates secure full-time work after uni, compared to like 62% of non-disabled graduates, I think. And that disparity doesn't happen by accident. It is a result of systemic barriers that are embedded throughout the higher education system. And I think to combat that, we really need career support that's genuinely tailored to the needs of disabled students, and a thorough evaluation of how disability can affect the full academic experience. Disability representation within higher education staff is also something I really care about. I think career progression is a real concern for me, just because my disability simply doesn't allow me to work in the same way or at the same pace as my non-disabled peers, and that can be a significant disadvantage when you're thinking about post-PhD pathways, for example, particularly in academia. Expectations around output and availability can make it much harder to secure teaching roles or postdoc positions, especially in the current climate. And for example, the whole kind of publish or perish mentality within research is so toxic, particularly within a disability context. And I think that's why, representation matters, not just at a student level, but within academic staff as well. I also strongly believe that improving conditions for disabled staff and students benefits everyone. So, things like disability leave, rather than relying on sick leave systems that just aren't designed for long-term conditions, can make a huge difference in creating a more sustainable higher education system. I think in the current higher education climate as well, with increasing pressures and proposed cuts, there's a real risk that well-being and disability support slips even further down the list of priorities. So I think all of that ultimately motivates me, and the belief that higher education can be better and it should be better, and that it's sort of within our collective power to make it better, if that makes sense.
I don't think I could have said it better. Because I think the main thing is, as someone, I've spent a lot of time doing kind of student voice and working at a very bureaucratic level while I was a student for 5 years. The thing is a lot of universities can complain that making big changes like this aren't financially or logistically viable. And I guess, especially for staff, the big part is showing that it is, even in the context that we already have. And if we can fix what we can within those limitations now, we're going to have a better chance to make bigger outcomes and bigger changes later down the line.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think what's needed is a genuine sort of whole institution approach to disability. So it's about, embedding that across the curriculum design and assessment and teaching practices and administration, so that it's just much more proactive, student-centered design rather than kind of reactive adjustments, if that makes sense. And it very much takes the onus off disabled students to constantly fix and explain and justify themselves, and really places the responsibility back on the wider system of higher education at its very fundamental core, if that makes sense.
And it would also give opportunities if they had the capacity to take them for disabled staff members as well, because they would be the ones, probably like a few disabled staff members, like spearheading the accessibility. Because they can't really do anything about us without us, as the saying goes.
Exactly. Yeah, 100%.
But then it gets into budget and it gets in the weeds, and it's like, you should do this, guys. You should do this.
Yeah, and I think it just makes the whole university experience better for everyone. It makes it a much more welcoming place, a more equitable place, and not just for disabled students, but for everyone.
I absolutely agree. We're going to wrap up to our last couple of questions now.
Sure.
So we've discussed most of your story, and I've mentioned this a few times this episode, but I have not interviewed someone with cystic fibrosis before, nor do I have any friends with the condition. And I want to just take a moment to shed a little more light on it. This might be a bit of a shorter one because we've covered so much already. But what's one thing you think everyone should know about your condition?
Yeah, so one thing I really wish people understood about cystic fibrosis is that despite some very positive medical advancements in recent years, it very much still exists. There's been a big shift in the discourse over the last 5 years, I would say, particularly after a new treatment became available on the NHS in 2020, that it aims to treat the underlying cause of CF rather than just manage its symptoms. And for many people, it was genuinely life-changing. Lung functions improved dramatically, health stabilised, life expectancy increased. But the public narrative quickly became one that CF is cured, and that just isn't the reality. Around 10% of people with CF can't take this treatment at all because of their specific genetic mutations. There's also serious global access issues, which is a completely different rant that you don't want to get me started on. And for others, including myself, while the treatment initially worked incredibly well, it came with very severe side effects that ultimately outweighed the benefits. So I made the difficult decision to come off of it, which, if I'm being honest, was devastating, not just physically, but emotionally. And it's been really hard to navigate those feelings and that kind of regression in lung health. But yeah, what's been particularly hard is that the complicated reality hasn't always been welcomed either. There's been a real divide within the CF community specifically, and people who spoke openly about the limitations or the negatives of these treatments have sometimes faced backlash. But yeah, so I think the main thing I wish more people understood is that cystic fibrosis is still a serious life-limiting condition, even in this new treatment era. Progress is really important, but it's uneven and it's unpredictable. That doesn't erase the need for ongoing flexibility and understanding and ongoing support, particularly in settings like higher education, where those assumptions can shape expectations and accessibility.
I don't know much about the CF treatments. I know that gene therapies had a lot on the horizon. Has there been any other research or NHS luck there with getting NHS treatment?
Yeah, so gene therapy is definitely something that's advanced a lot in recent years. So is phage therapy. However, I don't know too much about that. It's quite complicated, personalised treatment. But modulators have been on the market for many years. It started with one called Orkambi, which I was not eligible for because of my genetic mutations, but that had great results for many people. And then the sort of next phase was Kaftrio, which is the one that came out in 2020. There's one that's come out this year, which is meant to be even better. And yeah, so in each phase, they're meant to kind of get more effective, have less side effects, which is great, which is amazing. And it's completely changed the face of cystic fibrosis treatment. But there's always going to be a small percentage of people that it just doesn't have that effect for. And I think within the CF community, that really needs to be considered, because a lot of the public opinion is that it's fixed and it's over, and it's something we don't have to consider going forward, if that makes sense.
Yeah, which just isn't the case. Even if we cured it, right? There's still a lot of mental considerations about what people have been through. There's still so much there, but it doesn't matter because it's not cured.
Yeah, exactly.
I hope that those treatments get better to the point where maybe in many years we can call it a cure. Hopefully sooner rather than later, but I hope that does happen, because I don't fancy breathing through a straw, and doing it full time doesn't sound great. Through a straw with my nose pinched.
It's not ideal. I would not recommend to a friend.
Yeah, 0 out of 10. But good and bad. But for a physical condition that's life limiting, yeah. Last question. So we've actually covered a lot today, and you've got a very rich story. It's covered different universities, different degrees, and a lot about just long-term management and coming to terms with things, really.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to give you 1 or 2 sentences to do this.
Oh gosh, that's going to be difficult.
You can take some time to think. But what is one key takeaway you would like listeners to remember from your story?
I think the key takeaway is to remember the importance of prioritizing yourself and your health, even when that feels difficult or counter to the culture around you. I've had to learn some hard lessons over the last few years, and the version of me as an undergrad and the version of me now during my PhD are very different people. And I'm not saying that one is better or more correct than the other, but I do think I give myself a lot more compassion now, and I give myself a lot more grace. I'm going to add a very little context story. When I was younger, a teacher once called me stoic, and for years I really prided myself on that. But in recent years, I've really tried to unpack what that really means. And I heard someone talk about this earlier in the year, about that there's a difference between being stoic and being strong, and that true strength often lies in vulnerability. And I think there's a nuance there that can be really helpful in my journey of higher education, in that stoicism is all about going through tough times without complaint and keeping your head down and just getting through it. On the other hand, strength is about acknowledging the setbacks and the tough conditions and the realities of your situation, and understanding that it's okay to say that I'm not okay and that I maybe need a bit of help. And I think I've spent the last few years really trying to remind myself of that nuance. And I think one of the things my illness has given me is a great sense of perspective. When you grow up being told that you have a shortened life expectancy, a lot of the small stuff just doesn't really matter in the same way. And I really try to hold on to that. Yeah. That wasn't 2 sentences, but I'll stop.
We'll take it. I also feel like it needed to be said as well. I'm not going to be one to stop you with that, because I feel like that kind of perspective isn't something you're necessarily going to get unless you've lived through things. And it's such in that way, it makes it a very unique perspective. And I'm very grateful for that and for having you on today. Thank you.
Yeah, this has been great. Thank you so much.
Let me just close up. So HE Enabled is the show dedicated to sharing our experiences of disability, neurodivergence, and long-term health conditions in the UK higher education system. It also has a Patreon. If you fancy supporting the show, there is a link in the Linktree in the show description. I think that's it. Nicola, thank you so much for coming on.